In this presentation, we will be exploring essentialism within the concept of race and ethnicity and the media. We will be exploring essentialist theories and utilizing examples from entertainment media to illustrate the concepts of essentialism, intersectionality, and strategic essentialism. Essentialism is looking at the characteristics of a situation, individual, or group. We will be analyzing essentialism while looking at the concept of race and ethnicity. Someone's race or ethnicity is a fixed identity that cannot be changed and therefore is an essential characteristic of that individual. To introduce the topic of essentialism, we will first present its historical origins by referring to Plato and Locke, and then we will proceed with two scholars' definitions on essentialism, Brenda Allen and Angelique Richardson, followed by the identification of some underlying assumptions. Essentialist theories date back as far as Plato. Plato wrote that the concept of ideal forms, an abstract entity of which individual objects are mere facsimiles. To give an example, the ideal form of a circle is a perfect circle, something that is physically impossible to manifest, yet the circles that we draw and observe clearly have some idea in common. This idea is the ideal form. John Locke, known as the father of classical liberalism during the 17th century, was an English philosopher and physician regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers. John Locke suggested that the only way to gain knowledge was through experience and history, questioning the validity of natural essences. However, science from the modern era is based on underlying principles of essentialism, and these principles extend far beyond the realm of science and into society as a whole. The assumption in essentialist thinking that people can be categorized and understood according to biological truths of race or gender has played a major role in social stratification and the subordination of groups of people according to their race and gender. Essentialism leads to a view of human biology and thus human nature as unchanging. For Angelique Richardson, essentialism's reliance on biological determinism and a belief that people cannot change their essential natures undermines efforts to challenge social structures. Existing power structures begin to seem like normal consequence of our natural tendencies as people, and challenges the status quo are seen as challenging humans' essential natures. In answer to Richardson's fundamental questions about what it means to be human, essentialism answers with a set of unvarying historical characteristics divided along racial and gender lines. Barbara Allen critiques essentialism from her explicitly stated location as a middle-aged black woman socialized to view race as fundamental to identity. Allen disputes essentialist claims that identify as natural, inevitable, and universal, and writes that although identification with one's own racial group can be a point of pride and a source of community, essentialism can also lead to racial discrimination. Essentialism assumes that every member of any racial group shares the same naturally occurring characteristics as every other group member, and that an individual's race, ethnicity, and other cultural characteristics define that individual and make up the essence of who they are. The essence is seen as something unchangeable that exists at the very core of the individual. Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and academic who has written extensively on race and gender, points out that essentialism isn't always a bad thing, especially as it can help subordinate groups to strengthen their communities. She wrote that identity-based politics have been a source of strength, community, and intellectual development, and as well as means of creating a sense of cohesive community among subordinate groups. We used a video clip from a show called Brotown. Brotown is a televised program in New Zealand which satires the culture of four young boys expressing what it's like to grow up as a minority culture in Auckland City, Auckland.
Yesterday, a miracle happened at the exclusive Morningside Club, where for the first time in its ivy-covered history, it's allowed a brown person to join. Carol.
We as a club wanted to reflect the changing face of New Zealand. I mean, look at you. You're brown, and you're not in jail.
Mr. Papello, what a pioneering moment. You must feel over the moon.
There's lots of things I feel, and I wish one of them was your bum. Yeah, pew, pew.
I have mace.
Ooh, dinky. Oh, hang up.
Brotown functions to parody the cultural biases that are found in mainstream communications media, which is addressed by Barbara Allen. Specifically, she addresses the issue of cultural bias in mainstream media. Although Allen believes that the U.S. has made progress concerning racial equality, she identifies deficiencies in mainstream media to illustrate the evident cultural bias. In her opinion, It is crucial to recognize these deficiencies and effect the necessary changes in order to resolve issues of race in contemporary society. Furthermore, race is an important factor in creating identity and determining the distribution of wealth, power, and resources. In support of her position that mass media doesn't sufficiently explore race in critical and substantive ways, Allen believes that Eurocentrism dominates viewpoints expressed in mass media and appears to be preventing significant social progress with regards to racial equality. She adds that there is an absence of race-related issues, but rather a presence of racial discrimination in micro and macro areas of society. She also attributes media's lack of acknowledgement of race-related issues to existing socioeconomic disparities amongst different racial groups. Consequently, racial minority groups are indoctrinated to understand that race is both a source of pride and discrimination, yet white people seem to regard it as a non-issue. In addition, she claims that race is still a cue used to form perceptions of people, and that many of us have accepted certain essential racial traits, such as Mediterraneans being passionate or Asians being brainy, which is exacerbated by the fact that we learn about race through dominant discourses. Finally, Allen recommends that theorizing race can help to effect social change by informing other disciplines and building a more substantive body of knowledge. She seems to advocate for a more intersectional viewpoint in the media by suggesting that race should not be the only focus, but should be foregrounded along with gender, sexuality, class, and ability. Social construction should be utilized to create alternative constructions of race and race relations. Angelique Richardson, in her 2011 article, Essentialism in Science and Culture, extends the critique of essentialism to include a look at how this theory has shaped scientific thought. She suggests that essentialist thinking fixes people into categories in unchanging ways. Richardson suggests that essentialist ideas, deeply rooted and backed by science, are being challenged and disproven. She also suggests that race is no longer conceived of as inherited or essential, but rather learned within cultural context. The move is from essence to context. Biology has begun to look at processes over time, taking into account the historical context that is so important to social constructionists. In modern sciences, there is an interconnectedness between science and culture. As a result, race is now being conceived differently. It is no longer conceived of as inherited or essential, rather learned within cultural context. Essences, as part of cultural changes, come and go, but essentialist strategies do persist. Essentialism, or biological determinism, are also used to validate prejudice based on the idea that different races and genders have natural aptitudes and abilities, which reinforces the idea that our current social order is the natural or inevitable order. Richardson concludes by suggesting that real essences are not so much knowable as they were for Locke, but in an age of modern sciences, they are insupportable. In response to essentialist thinking, intersectionality theory was advanced in the early 90s by Kimberly Crenshaw as a means of exploring how various facets of identity intersect to create systems of oppression. Crenshaw focused on the intersection of race and gender in her 1991 article, Mapping the Margins: Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Crenshaw examined how patterns of racism and sexism interact to shape the experiences of women of color, and demonstrated that such intersections are rarely addressed in feminist or anti-racist discourse. Crenshaw wrote that anti-racism essentializes blackness according to the experiences of black men, while feminism essentializes womanhood according to the experiences of white women, leaving women of color voiceless and marginalized within either group. Crenshaw wrote that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. While feminism has failed to problematize race, anti-racist efforts have failed to problematize sexism, and as such, both movements inadvertently strengthen the power relations and ideologies that they set out to challenge. Women of color's marginalization and disempowerment becomes clear in instances when intergroup differences, such as race or gender, are ignored. For example, Crenshaw points to the debate over Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas during Thomas's confirmation to the American Supreme Court. While Thomas galvanized support among African American communities by comparing his Senate hearing to a high-tech lynching, Hill was rhetorically disempowered because she did not fit the dominant stereotype of a typical victim of racism or sexism. In the following video clip, Anita Hill discusses the impact of intersecting sexism and racism that caused her representation as a raceless woman.
One of the most profound pieces of rhetoric that is now a decade old was Clarence Thomas's response, an indignant response to Congress, when he accused you, and through you and your supporters, Congress, with engaging in a high-tech legal lynching, that he invoked the most emotional aspect of blackness, that is the idea of black men being lynched, and compared it to him when he thought he was sort of a raceless man. And you stood there with no one recognizing as a black and a woman that you were the true victim. How do you think about now being black, and particularly from your point of view being black and being female?
Well, it's amazing to me, and I will correct your quote of Thomas, because he didn't say a high-tech legal lynching, he said a high-tech lynching. He didn't even add the term legal. It was amazing to me that this individual who had basically denied the significance of race when he got in trouble, or when his nomination was in trouble, as they say now, played the race card. And it was amazing to me also at the same time that he then began to personify race. And I then became gender, but raceless. And he became race, but genderless. Now, what do I mean by that? Thomas had operated in a society that was moved by gender. Look at who were the members of Senate. Who were the people who had promoted him? They were men. He worked in a culture, Washington, D.C., of power that was run by and largely on behalf of men. Yet, people had forgotten that when he used the high-tech lynching metaphor. On the other hand, they had forgotten that I was black and I became a woman, a raceless woman. And I tend to say to people who don't really believe that his gender mattered, or that, particularly who don't believe that my race mattered in the assessment that went on during that time. I say, do you think that Strom Thurmond would have embraced Clarence Thomas so readily had I been blonde and white and blonde? Think about it. It would have changed, if you will, the complexion of the discussion altogether.
Seeley's struggle with the cultural norms that devalue her as a person based on her race and her gender is a striking representation of intersectional prejudice and identity construction. Another response to essentialist thinking is strategic essentialism, developed by post-colonial theorists to discuss strategies used by nationalities and minority or ethnic groups to represent themselves in a unified way. While there may be strong differences among group members and ongoing debates over group identity, subordinated groups sometimes consider it an advantage to temporarily essentialize themselves in order to foreground their group identity in a simplified way. The strategy of distilling one's culture into a handful of representative characteristics serves to make the group easily recognizable and promote awareness of the group's unifying characteristics and goals. For example, the Quebecois celebrate their distinct linguistic and cultural identity within Canada, using strategic essentialism to present French Canadians as a unified community seeking specific cultural and political goals. The temporary group solidarity that results from strategic essentialism allows the group to work together for social change. For Crenshaw, an intersectional view would have enabled Hill to state why her identity as a Black woman made a difference in her experience of intersecting sexism and racism. Rather than issuing a direct challenge to essentialism, intersectionality strives to identify the gaps in essentialist thinking. Crenshaw uses intersectionality to explore the experiences of people who fit into more than one category. For example, a person with an intersectional identity might be essentially Asian and essentially female. One might argue that Crenshaw's line of thinking could reinforce essentialism simply by leading to more categories within essentialism. In fact, in the conclusion to her article, Crenshaw suggests that people begin to regard organized identity groups as potential coalitions, so that Black groups could be seen as coalitions between Black men and Black women, and feminist groups would be coalitions between white women and women of color. This implies that women of color and Black women can be essentialized categories, as can white women and Black men. Despite the limitations of intersectionality theory, it provides a useful framework from which to analyze race, social construction, and identity. In the following clip from the movie The Color Purple, the main character, Celie, addresses the intersecting racism and sexism that has oppressed her and ends with the powerful affirmation of her own identity.
Maybe somebody let you work on that railroad. Make me sweep out the caboose.
Any more letters come?
Could be. Could be not. Who's to say?
Celie, no! I promise you. Until you do right by me, everything you think about is gonna crumble.
Don't do it, Miss Celie. Don't trade places with what I've been through.
Come on, Miss Celie. Let's go to the car.
He ain't worth it. He ain't worth it.
Who you think you is? You can't cuss nobody. Look at you. You're Black, you're poor, you're ugly, you're a woman, you're nothing at all.
Till you do right by me, everything you even think about gonna fail.
It's been a pleasure meeting all of you. Bye.
Glad I didn't come back just in time. Look like
Well, we need some stability around here, that's for sure.
I should have locked you up and just let you out to work.
The jail you planned for me is the one you're gonna rot in.
Celie, get in the car. Get in the car.
I knocked you up one.
Everything you've done to me, already done to you.
I'm poor, Black. I may even be ugly, but dear God, I'm here. I'm here.
Strategic essentialism's strengths are also its limitations. Reducing a social group to easily identifiable essential characteristics may aid that group in achieving its goals, but may result in a distortion of the group's image through oversimplification. Employing strategic essentialism may encourage people to stop short of considering the complex systems that underlie cultural categories and instead focus their attention on the culturally constructed differences that set groups apart. Stereotypes are often promoted and reinforced by strategic essentialism, preventing the development of new frameworks from which to view concepts such as race, identity, and individuality. Essentialism remains with us today, but it is challenged by approaches such as strategic essentialism and intersectionality. For example, Crenshaw points out that while racism and sexism both spring from essentialist thinking, some anti-racist and feminist groups have embraced such categorization as the source of social empowerment and reconstruction. For her part, Richardson quotes the opinion of legal scholars that racial essentialism is useful specifically to identify and rectify past or present legal inequities stemming from the cultural construction of race. And while proponents of identity politics make positive use of essentialism to build strength, community, and intellectual development among traditionally subordinated groups, essentialist thinking can be held at least partly responsible for some of the uglier moments in our cultural history. Race remains a foundation upon which we build our ideas and understandings about ourselves as well as others, sometimes with disastrous results. The recent murder of Florida teenager Trayvon Martin by a neighborhood watch volunteer, who was apparently alarmed by the combination of Martin's skin color and his choice of clothing, shed some light on the extent to which we as a society have internalized essentialist values and the damage that unexamined assumptions can do.